Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review. As we do every Thursday, I'm going to be discussing the last 7 Founders of the Day. Of course, I put out a Founder every day, 7 days a week, and I publish them as articles on my website. Now, I've made a few I know I make a lot of changes all the time. I'm trying to get this right for you guys. And the change I made recently is I started publishing both an article and a video every morning, both about the same founder. For whatever reason, I had run into a situation where I essentially had 2 founders of the day, one for the video and one for the website. So now I am every morning at 8 o'clock a.m. publishing a video and an article, brand new, both about the same person. Now, what I've been doing is doing this week in review and then publishing the clips throughout the week as the new founder. But that means I'm not giving my all to each individual video. Now, I'm still going to be doing this, and in fact, it's going to liberate us a little bit more, because that means throughout the week, and I need to change and update this on my actual account, but throughout the week, at night, Thursdays are the week in review, I'm still going to do this. It'll mean this can be a little more casual, so I don't have to be like making the video while I'm doing this. I can answer questions as we go. Additionally, I'm still going to have trivia on Fridays, and I've been doing these interviews Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, coupled with, certain long form videos I've been making. I'm going to continue doing those, but now that frees me up to not have to make it about a founder of the day, because I found that, especially in my interviews, I've been able to get a lot more out, a lot of fun conversations when we're not just trying to necessarily drill down on one person. Oftentimes we will still focus on one founder, but sometimes the stories wander. This way, I'll still be putting out a founder of the day video for you every morning, and we can have more fun content at night about the American Revolution. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for watching this whole time, sticking with me while I figure this whole YouTube thing out. And from there, let's continue on to our first founder, which is not a founder. It is the Impartial Examiner. As many of you probably know, every Friday, I've been publishing an anti-federalist paper, a review of an anti-federalist paper, and today is Impartial Examiner number 4. Tomorrow I'll be publishing the last one, Impartial Examiner number 5. Now, I know I told you I'm not going to be shooting these like videos anymore, but this is going to be the last one because I don't want to leave one of the 5 Impartial Examiners out. So I'm going to record this one as I've been doing, and after that, we're all done. So this is the last time I'm going to say, hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today we are discussing the Impartial Examiner, essay number 4. Now, essay number 4 was published in June of 1788. The Impartial Examiner had actually taken several months off from publishing their anti-federalist papers, but at this point, Virginia, where they were being published, has just about to meet for its Constitutional Ratification Convention, and the Impartial Examiner, as an anti-federalist, does not want that Constitution ratified. And what's really interesting in this one is he focuses on the presidential veto. See, while this paper is a lot shorter than the first 3, because the Impartial Examiner really likes to be flowery with the language, though the language is flowery, this paper is a lot shorter, and the Impartial Examiner studies the presidential veto, and he says, we're basing this Constitution largely off the British system, and while there are certainly benefits to the British system, especially because American common law comes from British common law to a large degree, the Impartial Examiner says the idea that the king should have a veto makes sense. The king is a monarch. It is an authoritarian rule, and while many of the kings of Europe, including England, has a constitutional monarchy where the people have a certain amount of say in what can or cannot happen, and Parliament is supposed to make the laws in Britain. The king, as the reigning authority who was given God's blessing to be the authority, well, the king should be able to veto any laws that he thinks are against his or she thinks is against her system. In America, however, giving this veto power to the president doesn't make sense. There is no mandate from heaven for the president to be there necessarily. There is no it is not a king. The president is an elected position, and it is the executive branch. And in a republic, we very much want to keep our branches separate. And giving the president the power to veto is essentially like giving a king a power to veto. The president is the executive branch and should have absolutely nothing to do with the legislative branch, or so the Impartial Examiner says. And therefore, giving them the veto, it's too much overlap between the different branches. The legislature should be able to legislate whatever it wants to legislate. And that, in essence, is the main gist of Impartial Examiner number 4. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely hit like and subscribe for more American Revolution content all week long. And there we go, everyone. I'm done forever pretending I'm not live and shooting a video. It was pretty dumb, and I'm sorry I did that. Let's move right along. I hope you learned a little bit about Impartial Examiner. It is a really interesting point. But we are going to move right along here. I'm choking on my own throat. Excuse me. Head in the game. We're going to talk about Patience Wright. Patience Wright is a whole lot of fun. So, I understand she was born on Long Island, not too far from where I was born. But she gets married to a barrel maker and moves to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and spends a good portion of her early life there, has a bunch of children. But unfortunately, her husband passes away fairly early, and she needs to make a living. Patience had a habit of making sculptures out of candle wax. Old candle wax, she'd take it and make sculptures of her friends and family. She had an idea. Hey, why don't I display my artwork? And she did. She opened up an art museum where she displayed her sculptures in Philadelphia. And it was one of the first art museums of this kind in not just America, in North America, colonial or American post-revolutionary America. She works with her, she ends up working with her sister, and they create about 70 life-size sculptures and put them on display. So they're like the same size as you or I, because it's a full sculpture of a person. People went and paid a fee to see her work, and her business takes off. She becomes so successful, she does some tours around the Northeast. She goes as far south as Charleston, South Carolina, and she even moves and opens. Unfortunately, her first place does burn down, and she ends up moving to New York City and opening another one in New York City. And I should note that she gives her creations a lifelike vibe by giving them glass eyeballs. So there you go. Unfortunately, her business this is all in colonial America, pre-revolutionary America. In 1771, her business again burns down in New York City, and she decides to relocate to England because there's more people there, and she can make a lot more money, she thinks, in London. And she does. She goes to London and makes a lot more money. She becomes so popular that she even does a sculpture of the king. Now, we can't confirm what I'm about to tell you about Patience Wright, because apparently she was spying for the Patriots from within London. Now, if this is true, spies don't really leave a trail for us to follow. If it's not true, well, then it's just a larger-than-life legend about a fascinating woman from American history. But apparently, she was spying for the Patriots, and she was putting letters that she sent to John Dickinson, an American patriot. She was putting them in her sculptures and sending the sculptures over the ocean, because while customs might break into this or that, they're not going to break open a sculpture. That's a really expensive item that a rich person probably bought, right? We're not going to break into that. Well, you should have, because apparently that was in there. Now, if you've seen the TV show Turn, the spy series about the Culper spy ring on Long Island, there is a person who is kind of portraying Patience Wright. She's the one who grabs the letter with her foot and slides it over. They portray her as a much younger woman than she actually was at the time. They also portray her as fairly promiscuous, which I have no idea if she was or wasn't. She was a lot older at the time. Not that that would stop someone from being promiscuous, but we certainly don't know. Though I'm not going to dive too much into that. And they also, again, we can't really confirm that this happened, but, Turn, as I've mentioned frequently, while I love the book and the author Alexander Rose, the TV show takes a lot of liberties, and you want to keep in mind it is a show and not necessarily real history. Now, she was at the very least super patriotic, and because of this, she loses favor with the king, and she kind of has to run away to France for a little while. Now, it's not hard to say if he really chased her out or if she made a little of this up. Again, many women are not documented as well as they should be, although she was a fairly famous one. and she was famous as an artist, and we all know how artists can embellish. So a good portion of Patience' life is very hard to trace. Now, what we do know, she gets to Paris, and she does a sculpture of Benjamin Franklin, who's over in Paris getting the French on board to join the revolutionary cause. Now, she ends up returning to London and builds another she continues her successful museum and makes a lot of money, and then she passes away there. Now, there is an extremely interesting coincidence about Patience right now. She's gone to London and made these wax sculptures, and made wax sculptures popular in London and in America. But when you think wax sculptures, you probably think Madame Tussaud. Now, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name right, probably not, but wax sculptures in America and around the world are famous for Madame Tussaud. What's interesting is about the same time that Patience Wright was in Paris making sculptures of Benjamin Franklin, Madame Tussaud, Marie Tussaud, was also in Paris making sculptures of Benjamin Franklin. I can't confirm if they knew each other. Trust me, I've looked. I don't know if they knew each other, but they were both in Paris making sculptures of the same royalty at the same time. They probably at least were familiar with each other. How many women were making wax sculptures of Ben Franklin in Paris at the same time? So, Patience goes back to London and starts a really popular museum, as I said. But then the French Revolution starts, and Madame Tussaud also goes to France. Also goes to London from France, and starts her own museum just after Patience Wright dies. And Madame Tussaud picks up the banner from where Patience Wright left off and built a worldwide empire of wax museums. And now Madame Tussaud is the name associated with wax museums, even though she picked up in the trail blazed by Patience Wright. Hope you enjoyed that. I definitely hit like. If you guys have any questions, this is live, so I'll be happy to answer. If you're watching in the future, then it's not live. Thank you for watching in the future. Definitely hit like. Why don't we move on to our next founder, unless a question comes up. Again, I'm not shooting these. I'm shooting daily videos now to put out with these people when I publish the article. So this is a more casual. We can keep this casual, hang out, chit chat. If you have any questions. We're going to move on to Johann De Calbe, who's better known as Baron De Calbe. I think it's pronounced Cobb, like corn on the cob, but there's that L, so I kind of try and sneak it in there when I say it. Baron De Calbe. I say it's like I'm saying corn on the cob, very fancy. Baron De Calbe was a German who had fought in several wars. He had fought in the War of Austrian Succession and then joined the 7 Years' War, selling his services to France. And he moves up in the French army. He moves up in French services. Eventually, he gets married to a very wealthy woman and starts being called Baron. And he was born pretty poor. I don't want to call him a peasant necessarily, but he was born very low on the wealthy scale. And he makes his way up through hard work and good militarying. Now, he starts living the life of a nobleman, and then he's asked by the King of France to go to British North America. This is still just between the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War, but France knows that the Americans are not very happy with the new taxes being portrayed by the British. And since the Americans aren't happy, France really wants to know. Now, Baron de Calbe is famous as a major general in the Continental Army, but it's not often talked about that he was actually sent to America before the Revolutionary War by France. But since he was German from birth, he could just go under the guise of being a wealthy German touring British North America, which was true. He was a wealthy German who was going on a tour of British North America. A very easy thing to do. But he was sent there by France with the explicit purpose of determining just how angry the Americans were at the British. And could France maybe help stir up a little bit of rebellion, cause their old traditional enemy a little bit of trouble? So De Calbe goes to America, comes back and says, well, they're pretty angry about it, but this is about the time of the Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act gets resolved in America. And because the Stamp Act Congress sent some grievances, and the British said, okay, we understand your grievances. We can make these laws, but we're going to take them away. But we can. They announced the Declaratory Act saying we definitely could make these laws, but we just don't feel like it right now. So that goes away, and then France doesn't get involved, and everything doesn't really get all the way back to normal, gets a little back to normal. About a decade goes by, and there's some more grievances, and then what we call the First Continental Congress got together and sent more grievances, thinking this is going to work, just like it did 10 years ago for the Stamp Act. This time it doesn't work, and a war breaks out. And, well, Baron de Calbe isn't a military man, and there's no militarying to do in Europe. He happens to meet Silas Deane, who was the first American to go over to Paris and start recruiting people for the Continental Army. And then shortly thereafter, Benjamin Franklin shows up, more famously. And de Calbe talks to Deane and Franklin. They meet in secret. And he signs an agreement to be a major general in the Continental Army. So he gets out on a boat to sail to America. And who is he on a boat with? Well, his protege. There's a young man who had done a good amount of studying under de Calbe, whose name you might recognize. It's the Marquis de Lafayette. And the young Lafayette sails with de Calbe over to the United States. They sail, I believe they arrive in South Carolina, help out a little down there, make their way up to the Continental Congress. And by the time they get there, the Continental Congress says, no thanks. Silas and Ben have sent us enough French generals. We don't need any more. Now, they've traveled quite a distance over the ocean on the boat to get there. They're not happy about this. Lafayette famously offers to work without pay, and that endears him to General Washington. And once you're endeared to General Washington, you are endeared to everyone in America at that point in American history. And therefore, the Continental Congress kind of says, okay, Lafayette, you're in. Now, de Calbe is a little bit confused about this. Why am I not getting mine? I want to get paid. I sailed here to get paid. I'm here to win this war for you. Pay me. And the Continental Congress doesn't say no, and they don't say yes. They kind of sit on it for a few weeks, almost 2 months approximately, when de Calbe says, I'm done. I'm going home. And he leaves. He gets on his horse and starts leaving to go catch a boat. And it's just about this time where Lafayette says, Washington, you need this guy. And then Washington and Lafayette say to Congress, you need this guy. And then Congress says, okay, fine. And they literally send word to him and catch him up after he's left town. He's riding away in his carriage, and they catch up to the carriage and say, come back. We'll make you Major General. He's like, fine. And he goes back, and he joins the army. Now, he doesn't play the biggest role in the whole world. He does command a solid contingent of men. By 1780, okay, so he gains increasing respect from the men serving under him, because again, there's a lot of tension between the Americans, especially the American officers and these French officers who came and just cut them in line for positions. But he earns the respect of his men because he is a well-trained, solid military man. Unfortunately, he is then sent to the Southern Department to be one of the leaders of the Southern Army. He is very, very disappointed when Horatio Gates is chosen over him to lead the Battle of Camden. Now, Horatio Gates is a different conversation for a different day. He does not do a good job at the Battle of Camden. Camden is one of the worst losses of the war by the Americans, and the sad part is Johann De Calbe, his horse is shot out from under him during the Battle of Camden, and it goes down, and the horse injures him a little bit, but by the time he can get up, the British come over, and he gets shot several times, and then he gets bayoneted a bunch of times. So he is like real torn up, and then Lord Cornwallis comes over and sees it's him and says, okay guys, that's enough. Bring him to my physician. And Cornwallis knows De Calbe and has enough respect for him to bring him over and have his own physician take care of him. And I don't remember the exact quote, but it is something along the lines of, I'm sorry to see you in this position, De Calbe. I am sorry to see you wounded. And then 3 days later, suffering greatly for 3 days, De Calbe does pass away, and he's buried in South Carolina. There's also another quote that I can't remember exactly. George Washington eventually visits his grave. I believe it's during his tour as a president. And he says something along those lines of, so this is the dirt that holds the great De Calbe. So that is a little bit of an overview of General De Calbe. Again, a fairly well-known story of him. The part that I really focus on in my article is his coming over to spy for France before the war, which is usually totally overlooked when, on the rare occasion you hear a story about Baron De Calbe. It's usually pretty overlooked at that point. Again, if you guys have any questions, definitely let me know. I'm here for it. And why don't we see who our next founder is? Let's see if I can remember. Okay, our next founder is a bunch of founders. So every once in a while, we have a holiday like Memorial Day, where I sip a glass of water before I continue talking. And I usually choke on it. I'm sorry, I had to turn off my AC unit because it makes too much noise when I'm shooting the videos. That's why I start the live videos looking fresh and clean, because I just took a shower, and by the end I'm going to be beet red and probably gross and sweaty. Thank you for your understanding. Memorial Day, I wrote about 6. I do this every year on Memorial Day. I pick 6 founders. I don't know where I got the number 6 from. Picked the number 6 a few years ago, and since then I picked 6 founders. I did make a video about this, but let's go through it real quick. They're fun stories. I just put little blurbs about each one, so I'll go through them as quick as I can. If you have any questions, let me know. The first one is Christopher Seider. I believe it's pronounced Cider. It's Seider. I believe it's the German pronunciation, which means E-I. I focus on the I. From the little German I retained from when I took lessons in school. In German, the emphasis on the second letter, when it's I-E or E-I. In America, we usually focus on the second one. In German, we usually focus on I don't know. I think it's pronounced Cider. Either way, Christopher Cider is arguably the first casualty of the American Revolution. We all know about the Boston Massacre, when a bunch of British redcoats were surrounded by a mob of angry rioters who threatened to attack them, and they shot, thinking it was self-defense. Because if you throw projectiles at a soldier, if you attack a soldier, they might soldier back at you. So especially when they're on duty. Boston Massacre is obviously very famous. If you clicked on a video about the American Revolution, you know what the Boston Massacre is. You might not know that just 2 weeks before that, a funeral was held for Christopher Seider, because there was a bunch of rioters attacking, this time, someone's house. The person whose house it was is Ebenezer Richardson, who was a customs collector who would not resign his position. And when these rioters started kicking in his door, he was afraid for his family, so he fired a warning shot out the window. Now, when you fire a warning shot out the window, first of all, don't shoot a gun out into the air, because we know now that bullets come down. Back then, there weren't so many people. So if you were going to fire a warning shot in the late 18th century, fire it up into the air and out into the ocean. Don't fire it down into the crowd, because you might hit a child. And that's what Ebenezer Richardson did. He hit a child named Christopher Seider. Christopher Seider was probably about 12 years old, might have been as young as 10. He was killed when they fired the bullet. He went down, and they had Sam Adams organized a huge funeral procession for him. And that was that. And then 2 weeks later, the Boston Massacre happens. And actually, the Boston Massacre monument, the gravestone in Massachusetts, actually has Seider's name on it also. Talk about Richard Montgomery, who you might know, was a brigadier general, promoted to major general, really led the invasion of Quebec, dies right away, right when they get there. Hugh Mercer, a leader of the flying camps. He was kind of like Minutemen were expected to be able to go to Lexington and Concord right when things happened. Flying camps were that for the Continental Army. He is killed during the war, as all of these martyrs were. I write them as martyrs because they were considered martyrs in their own time. William Ledyard, who was a part of the Fort Griswold massacre. He, in Connecticut, very short story long. In Connecticut, there was when George Washington starts moving south to Yorktown, the British didn't want him to go south to Yorktown, so they tried to pretend to invade Connecticut in order to get Washington to come back north, and they attacked New London, Connecticut, on the Thames River, which had forts on both the east and west side of the river. Ledyard was on the east side in Fort Griswold, and Benedict Arnold attacked the west side because he wanted to attack the side that had his hometown of New London in it. And the other men who were under his command but got a little out of hand invaded Fort Griswold, and even though they surrendered, really massacred a bunch of people. It was kind of a crappy thing to do. Interesting about Ledyard, I should do an article on him. His nephew, John Ledyard, becomes an adventurer, travels the whole world. Isaac Hayne was a guy who was captured by the British. They said you could be on parole if you go home with your family, because his family had smallpox. He went home. He signed a loyalty oath just to stay with his family, even though he didn't really mean it, because the British then come back and say, well, we're going to impress you. You need to fight for us. And he said, no, 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 that's not part of our deal. So he ran away and joined the Continental Army again. And then he was captured again. And the second time he was captured, they didn't give him parole. They hung him for breaking his parole. And his name was apparently both Ledyard and Hayne had their names spoken about at Yorktown, allegedly by General Lafayette himself. Lastly, for the founders who fell for this Memorial Day, I spoke about Nathaniel Scudder, who was a signer of the Articles of Confederation from New Jersey and actually a doctor who joined the militia and fought with the militia. And just at the same time Yorktown is happening in Virginia, keep in mind that there are skirmishes breaking out all across the colonies, or states, even as Yorktown's happening. And one of these minor skirmishes happens in New Jersey, and Nathaniel Scudder was killed. And Scudder, he was a signer of the Articles of Confederation, was killed while an active member of the Continental Congress. And he was the only actively serving member of the Continental Congress to die in battle while a member of the Continental Congress. So that's a super brief overview. If you guys have any questions, anyone just popping in, like I've been saying kind of over and over again, going back to the old forum is going to be more casual. I started every morning when I publish my articles. I'm also publishing a video the same day, basically the same time, about the same founder, so that I have one founder of the day both on video and on paper instead of having two, which didn't make any sense the whole time. So that way this conversation can be a lot more casual. And if you have questions, which none of you seem to, but if you did have questions, I am happy to answer them. And we're going to bounce over here to Moses Robertson. Moses Robertson is a very interesting character. As a young man, he moved to Vermont with his family. His father, Samuel, was actually one of the founders of Bennington, Vermont. So he was already an important member of the community. He became well before the Revolution. Robinson becomes town clerk. He holds the position of town clerk for about 20 years, which he didn't have any legal training, but this is a really important position, especially at the time, because the town clerk, and not just in this town, all across the colonies, the town clerk was essentially responsible for all the legal goings-ons. Any new bill that was passed, any correspondence that had to be sent officially, generally traveled through this person. Now, Vermont wasn't Vermont at this time. It was the New Hampshire grants. That's what New Hampshire thought it was, because New Hampshire thought it was part of New Hampshire, but also New York thought it was part of New York. And Vermont was starting to think they were their own thing, and everyone else was saying, no, you're not. Come on, Vermont. Get it together. But to settle the dispute between New York and New Hampshire, Robinson's father, Samuel, actually goes to England to try and figure out, okay, who are we actually responsible to? Because there were kind of little mini wars breaking out between the people of Vermont and the people of New York. Because the people of Vermont generally associated more with New Hampshire, because New Hampshire is the one who granted them rights to this property, generally speaking. Granted, there were some people, parts of Connecticut thought it was Connecticut too, because it was on the Connecticut River. Really confusing. But people would come in from New York because they'd buy land from New York, would sell them this land in Vermont, and they'd come in to take their land, and the people in Vermont would violently, if they have to, remove them from the property they considered their own. Robinson's dad, Samuel, goes to England to settle this, and sadly passes away on the trip. And suddenly Moses Robinson, now the head of the family, finds himself leader of the family and one of the leaders of Vermont in this very precarious situation. And while they're in this precarious situation, well, by golly, a war breaks out. A revolutionary war breaks out down in Massachusetts. Now, Robinson, as well as many of his brothers, were part of the Green Mountain Boys. And we think of the Green Mountain Boys as a part of the Continental Army, but they really weren't. They were a militia, but they weren't really a state militia. Most militias were associated with the state, but they were associated with Vermont, the Green Mountains. And there was no Vermont. So they were their own thing hanging out here. And they end up they do obviously join the revolutionary cause. The Green Mountain Boys become famous for this reason. And when they do, when things break out, Moses Robertson fights with the Green Mountain Boys. Now, I don't believe he actually goes to Ticonderoga. I believe his brothers do, but I don't think he does, although it was hard to confirm, because very shortly after the war breaks out, Vermont needs people to take charge, and Robinson is already in charge. And then the Revolutionary War, the United States declares independence from Great Britain. And when this happens, Vermont says, wait, but what state are we in? And they declare their own independence from everyone. Now, no one in the entire world recognized Vermont's independence. I mean, a little bit later, Britain kind of does in the Haldimand Affair, but that's different. We're not getting into that right now. Either way, they call themselves an independent nation, and I like to think that Vermont was an independent nation for 14 years at the beginning of American history. Unfortunately, no one else thought so. So Vermont was kind of trapped doing its own thing for a while, just hanging out there. But Robinson is very quickly called to help create the new, I want to say state constitution, but nation's constitution. And almost right after this, he is appointed as the first Chief Justice of Vermont. And he has the position of Chief Justice of Vermont of the Supreme Court for almost a decade. During this time, he becomes one of the people who's really arguing for joining the Union. In fact, most scholars seem to agree that Vermont's whole declaring independence thing was really just a move to become the 14th state. It really seems to have been, they were very eager for that to happen as a way to settle these boundary disputes already. Robinson actually goes to the Continental Congress, not as a delegate, but as a representative of Vermont, because Vermont didn't have delegates to the Constitution Convention, the Continental Congress. Though, side note, William Samuel Johnson of Connecticut did accept responsibility for representing the people of Vermont while he was there. He corresponded directly with Vermont and actually told them, I will speak in your favor, because he was very much in support of self-determination. That being said, never happened. Moses Robinson goes to the Continental Congress, tries to become a state, doesn't happen, gets sent back. Eventually, he does retire from private life for about 2 years before being cast back into the authority of President, as you see next to me, of Vermont. He is elected president of the independent nation of Vermont. And it's during this time, when he's elected president, the United States Constitution has already been ratified, and the process of getting Vermont to be the 14th state has started. Because under the Constitution, it was a lot easier to become a state than under the Articles of Confederation. We see, Vermont becomes the 14th state right away. Like a year and a half later, Kentucky becomes a state. Tennessee becomes a state like 3 or 4 years later. So it becomes a lot easier to become a state. Even though technically the needs, the demands, the requirements the requirements to become a state are basically the same. It just becomes a lot easier because you don't need all 13 states to approve it. And they become a state. And while Moses Robinson is no longer president when they actually become a state, he does oversee a good amount of the early stages of this transition. And for his service, he is elected as one of the 2 inaugural United States senators from Vermont. So he is the first person chosen to represent Vermont in the national government. And that's what I know about Moses Robinson. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something. If you guys have any questions or comments, that's why I do them live, so you guys can ask. But I can keep going. I am going to take a sip of water because I am getting sweaty. I just burned so many calories talking about the Rev War, man. I'm so excited for the American Revolution. You'd think it'd get old after all these years, but no, there's still so many fun stories, like Tommy Wharton over here. So, the Wharton family, I want to talk about the Wharton family for a minute. And families in Philadelphia in general. So, Philadelphia, at this point, is the biggest, the most populated state, the most populated city in colonial America. And actually, I've heard accounts, I have never been able to confirm this, but I've had several people tell me very sternly that it's actually second only to London in population in the British Empire at the end of the 18th century. I find this really hard to believe. I am comfortable saying it is the largest city in colonial British Empire. That I am comfortable with because it is it's pretty big. It's got almost 40,000 people, which I know is not big today. And by the turn of the century, New York would surpass it. New York explodes in population after the Revolutionary War, but Philadelphia was the most populated place, and it was extremely wealthy, and there were a lot of families who made a lot of money being merchants, like a lot of money. And these people were not exactly thrilled to throw off the British crown. I mean, look, we even have people at the First Continental Congress who end up becoming loyalists because they're unhappy with certain moves the government's making, but they want to make money, and throwing off the most powerful empire in the history of the world is not necessarily a great way to make money. The Wharton family was one of the middle families. One of those families hanging out there that didn't know what side to take. They just wanted to be on the right side of the war, and whoever won, they wanted to be on the side of whoever won. Now, as for Thomas Wharton, he very slowly joins the Patriot cause. He's really not sure at first until, really, arguably, I've come to understand just recently. I've really come to the conclusion that the Massachusetts, the name of the act always escapes me, but the Massachusetts Act, the Massachusetts Suppression Act, the Restraining Act, I don't remember the exact name, but the act that shuts down the port of Massachusetts. It's an act done specifically to get revenge on Massachusetts. I gotta look it up. The Massachusetts Government Act. I didn't even need to type it in. I typed in Massa, and it pointed out, hey, you look this up all the time. Okay, forgive me for my brief interlude there. The Massachusetts Government Act. Many of the other colonies were not really excited to start a war with the mother country, but the Massachusetts Government Act was put in place in response to the Boston Tea Party, and it essentially shut down the port of Massachusetts and said, you guys can't import food, you can't import anything. So they needed to get food from the other colonies, and this was too much for other people, including Thomas Wharton, who sees this and says, well, if they're just going to starve people to death, like, what kind of government starves its citizens to death? And that was the point. And many different colonies actually set up committees to send food to Massachusetts because they could send it down on horseback and carriage across Massachusetts to literally feed these people. And one of the arguments, even in England at the time, to the Massachusetts Government Act was, you're going to really, like, you could starve innocent people who support the king and support these laws. And the attitude was, not by everyone in Parliament, not at all, because there were people in Parliament saying this, saying, you're hurting innocent people for no reason. And the idea was, well, unfortunately, you gotta break a few bricks to make an egg. Wait, what's it? You gotta break a few eggs to make an omelet. And Thomas Wharton is one of many people who were like, no way. And he quickly joins the cause. He, as soon as he shows up, being from one of the wealthiest families in Virginia and one of the leaders of a wealthy family in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania at large, being from one of the wealthiest families in Pennsylvania, he's immediately brought into the Committee of Correspondence as soon as he says he wants to. And he is immediately brought into the Committee of Safety and is very quickly installed as chairman of the Committee of Safety. And I'll remind you, committees of correspondence were for communicating with the other colonies. Committees of safety was for overseeing the militia within the state. And he essentially becomes commander-in-chief of the rebel forces in Pennsylvania. Now, again, this is before the war breaks out, so there's no need for a commander-in-chief, and there's no rebel forces yet. But as soon as the war breaks out, suddenly he's commander-in-chief of the Pennsylvania Army, for lack of a better term. As many of you who watch regularly know, I always say, it wasn't just the Continental Army versus the British Army. It was the Continental Army and each state's militia as its own independent army, plus the Green Mountain Boys we discussed before, plus Kentucky's militia. There were, about 17 or so armies fighting for the Patriots once the French come on board. Thomas Wharton is in charge of the Pennsylvania Army, and now when he's in this position, and then independence is declared. So, of course, you need to have a constitution, and a constitution is written. Now, Pennsylvania's first constitution is very strange. We're not going to get too deep into it, but it's very fun and doesn't work very well. But they, instead of having a governor, have a president, because they, as all the other states did, at first saw themselves as an independent nation. So Thomas Wharton is chosen as the first president of Pennsylvania. And again, the president was a chief executive, a commander-in-chief, if you will. His job was to execute the laws and lead the army. And since he was already doing that, it made him a great candidate for this. Now, the British do enter Philadelphia after the Battle of Germantown. And famously, the Continental Congress runs away from Pennsylvania, or runs away from Philadelphia, goes to York, Pennsylvania, then Lancaster, Pennsylvania. What is often overlooked is that the Patriot government of Pennsylvania also had to run away. So Thomas Wharton leads the government of Pennsylvania out to Lancaster also, not alongside, but pretty much alongside the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress and the state of Pennsylvania's government, flee Philadelphia together. And they head on over to Lancaster. And this is when Thomas Wharton's story ends, because just in his early 40s, they get to Lancaster, and according to Pennsylvania's Vice President George Bryan, His Excellency Thomas Wharton died here very unexpectedly. He just kind of dies. And it's a terrible reminder that not only through early American history, through most of human history, death was such a common part of life. You know, we're very fortunate today that we survive a lot of things. Our medicine is great, and we have hospitals that they just did not have. And Thomas Wharton just kind of up and died in his early 40s, despite being the most powerful political figure in the Pennsylvania government. And with Pennsylvania being such an important colony and early state, arguably after Virginia, the most important, his death is a tragedy, because he very well could have played a gigantic important role in the development of the early United States. Even if he doesn't make it to the federal level, he could have still played a very important role in developing Pennsylvania. And sadly, he misses his shot. I should give a shout out. He does have a younger brother. Let me see if I have. I don't have it up. I'll pull it up. He does have a younger brother whose first name escapes me right now. Wharton, who's he is, I call him the fun-loving fun-loving mayor of Philadelphia. His name is Samuel Wharton. Okay, he has a bunch of brothers. Robert Wharton, his younger brother, is the fun-loving mayor of Philadelphia. He really just liked hunting and going fox hunting, going fishing, and then they elected him mayor of Philadelphia during the Washington administration, and he's mayor on and off for about 20 years and becomes really popular, and to this day is the longest serving mayor of Philadelphia, despite the fact that he doesn't really seem to do a lot of governing, although he does oversee the construction of the prison. I forget the name of the prison, but one of the first early prisons in Philadelphia, he oversees construction of, and then there is a fire, and he is able to control kind of a fiasco situation. They build a prison, put people in it, it burns down. And he is able to get them through that. There's also another, I believe, brother, Samuel Wharton, who went to London looking out for traders in central Pennsylvania, again, during the pre-revolutionary era. Certain people trading were not getting, not only central Pennsylvania and what we now know as central New York, basically where I live. He went to England looking out for them, and his brother Samuel is very important into the development of the Ohio Valley. So like I said, I'm just talking about his brothers because just put an emphasis on how important the Wharton family really was to colonial Pennsylvania. Yes, Pennsylvania. I'm going to take a quick sip of water, and then we're going to talk about our next founder, Freeborn Garrison. Look at this name. Look at it. Again, I'm sorry, I have to use my ugly blue water bottle because I still got this toothache. Can't get a root canal for a month, so I just gotta drink and eat out of one side of my face. Don't worry about me, I'll make it. Freeborn Garrison, like everyone else that we talk about on this channel, didn't make it because he lived 200 years ago, and no one's made it. Sadly. Sadly, every story I tell ends exactly the same way. So, Freeborn Garrison, I've seen called the Methodist Paul Revere. This is a name he got later on in posterity after he passed away, because him and Paul Revere were both a little famous at the time, but Paul Revere was not nearly as famous to have people named after him in his life. But let's talk about him, because he's really interesting for several reasons. So, Freeborn Garrison, he grows up on a plantation in the South, I believe in Virginia, it might have been Maryland. I don't remember exactly where his plantation was, but he starts hearing voices as a kid that are talking to him. He tells his friends and family, and he understands the voices to be the voice of God speaking to him, which is fine. I'm not going to get too into the religion part of this. I am not fantastic at, I'm not a student of theology, so I don't want to pretend I am. And so I'm going to be very careful how I discuss this topic today. And he does hear voices that he believes is God. He wants to be a preacher, and then he suffers a bunch of tragedies. His mom dies, his sister dies, a few of his servants that he's close to die, and he doesn't become a preacher for a while. Now, he does get a fantastic education, growing up a very wealthy lifestyle, and then he meets Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury is one of the early Methodist itinerant preachers. Again, itinerant preacher is a traveling preacher. Basically go from town to town, spreading the word. Methodism is very interesting. It's a fairly new religion in the mid-18th century. And the gentleman whose name is, of course, eluding me right now, his name is, I think it's Wellesley. I think there's an L in it. Is it Wellesley? Yes, now John Wellesley. I found it. Okay, sorry about that. John Wellesley essentially is the founder of Methodism, and he lives in England. And while he's in England, he starts sending preachers to the colonies, and they come over and they travel and try and spread the ideas of Methodism. Again, I'm not going to get too into Methodism, but it's a certain way to practice Christianity, and we'll leave it at that. At the time, it was a fairly new way, and we want to remember that leading up to the American Revolution is the First Great Awakening, and then the Second Great Awakening starts just after, basically during the Washington into the Jefferson administrations. The Second Great Awakening starts, and during the First Great Awakening, Methodism is one of these religions that's very important and is growing in popularity. And they're having what we would consider revivals today. Many of these itinerant preachers would go to a place and have people there and just stand up on a stage and bellow out sermons. They didn't have microphones, so they had to be really loud while they were being fantastic orators. And Francis Asbury is one of the most important of these. He really spreads the word. Freeborn Garrison meets with him and studies under Francis Asbury, and then himself becomes an itinerant preacher. And it's about this time his father passes away. And when Freeborn Garrison's father passes away, he inherits a lot of property and a lot of slaves. And I don't know if it's because his first name is Freeborn, but he has committed himself against slavery. And this is one of the things we should note about Methodism in general. Even during later slave revolts in Virginia, specifically the Gabriel's Rebellion, Gabriel very specifically says, don't attack Methodists, because or Quakers also, because Methodists were one of the people who were not only against slavery, but actively opposing. And so Freeborn inherits these slaves and pretty shortly thereafter liberates, or I should say emancipates, all of them. And then he goes off to live his preacher life, moving around. And this is why in hindsight we give him the name the Paul Revere of Methodism, because all the itinerant preachers traveled far and wide, but Garrison apparently traveled the farthest and the widest, spreading the good word. It's during this time, he ends up talking a lot about slavery and anti-slavery. He publishes a pamphlet called A Dialogue Between Due Justice and Professing Christian. And essentially in it, he's saying, due justice is doing the right thing. Professing a Christian, saying you're a Christian doesn't count if you're not trying to emancipate slaves. And it's, the Christian thing to do, according to Mr. Garrison over here, would be to emancipate your slaves. And he has an extremely interesting, an extremely important effect on this, especially around Delaware and Maryland, in that area. Because these are central states. Like, by the time the Civil War rolls around, Delaware and Maryland stay with the North, but they still own slaves. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation famously doesn't eliminate all slavery, just in the rebelling states, because you didn't want to make these states mad. Now, that's far in the future, but the stat I saw, I only saw this in one place, so, you always want to take things with a grain of salt if you only see one place, and I'm putting that out there very specifically, but the stat I saw was that by 1810, 76, stat I saw said 76, I'm not going to round off, 76% of the black people living in Delaware were free citizens, which, again, obviously, we want 0% slavery, I get that, but the idea that a state that would still have slaves until the Civil War had that big population of free people. A lot, what I've been reading about Mr. Garrison over here, Preacher Garrison, Pastor Garrison. Okay, I'm in too deep. Freeborn Garrison. His influence. He would go and preach to slaves on plantations, but he would invite the slave master to come and listen, and then he would even go preach just to white congregations, and his speeches were essentially the same, and he was so convincing about the Christian thing to do is to emancipate your slaves that he contributed to the emancipation of hundreds of slaves in the southern mid-Atlantic region, mostly Delaware, but Maryland. By this point, Pennsylvania is kind of on its way anyway, but even in Virginia, just based on his moral argument against slavery. Now, he does this for a while. Through the Revolutionary War, he doesn't really take a side. He says he supports the Patriots, but as most Methodists had been sent to North America by Wellesley in England, when the Revolutionary War breaks out, most Methodists go back to London. Now, Francis Asbury, that I had mentioned earlier, he's one of the people who stays in America. There's another one whose name eludes me, but he does stay. Garrison is really the main person promoting Methodism during this point in time. But once the Revolutionary... Oh, he also goes to jail for a little bit. Now, it seems that he went to jail because he wouldn't sign a loyalty oath for the Patriots, but it also kind of sounds like the real reason he was sent is because he kept talking about emancipating slaves and how slavery was wrong, and well, we didn't really want to rile up the slaves while we're trying to fight this war, especially because the British are already offering them freedom if they fight, so maybe a little bit not so much on the slavery thing. And they, he goes to prison for one of those reasons. We're not sure. He's only there for a few months. He gets out. He's treated fine. And he continues his travels. Then he ends up moving to New York State. He moves to Rhinebeck on the Hudson River. And he stops traveling primarily at this point. He does travel his whole life, but he cuts down his travels a whole lot because he marries into the Livingston family. He marries Catherine Livingston, and her brothers, of the many siblings she has, one is Chancellor Robert Livingston, who was on the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, though he had very little involvement in it and didn't sign the document because he ran back home to New York to be Chancellor for 20 years. He would later go on to, make the Louisiana Purchase with James Monroe and, bring steamships back with Robert Fulton and build the first successful steamboat company on the Hudson River. Another brother was Edward Livingston, who would later serve as, I believe, Secretary of State for Andrew Jackson, and wrote the Livingston Codes, which were very early prison reform. Another brother-in-law was Morgan Lewis, who would go on to be governor of New York State. So he marries into a real wealthy family, and he kind of settles in Rhinebeck. But what's interesting is his home now becomes kind of a stopping point for itinerant preachers through the Second Great Awakening. He's the link, really, of Methodism between the First Great Awakening and Francis Asbury and the Second Great Awakening. And these itinerant preachers in the Second Great Awakening often stop at his house, which is conveniently located right in the middle of the Atlantic states, so that he can, so they can rest and recuperate in a very comfortable environment. Well, that's the life of Freeborn Garrison. I'm sure I've said something that offended someone at this point. I wish I could speak more authoritatively on Methodism itself. I did consider writing about it a little more in my article, but I am not a Methodist, and I know religion can be a very particular subject, and if I got something wrong, it's not only like people would correct me on that, but I'd offend people, and look at me. I don't want to offend people. I'm a nice guy. I want you guys to enjoy coming here. I don't want you to... I try and avoid as much controversy as I possibly can. As you may have noticed with me, my ginger touch with discussing slavery. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like. No one's has any questions, which is fine. I don't have to. I'm more than happy to talk to myself. Do it all the time. But unless there are any questions, I am going to leave you. Someone just popped in right at the end here. You missed the whole hour. Like and subscribe. Talk about the American Revolution all week long. Not always live. I am going to wrap up with a reminder in case anyone missed the beginning. This video is me discussing the 7 articles I published on my website, Founder of the Day, through the last week. Each Founder of the Day for the last 7 days. I used to put clips out of this all week long, but what I'm doing now is I'm actually releasing an article and a video about the same person every single morning. so that I have, instead of my YouTube channel and my website, they are both one and the same. I write the article, I shoot a video about it, so it's fresh in my mind. It's better content. I hope you enjoy it more. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments. And tomorrow is trivia. Tomorrow is Friday, and on Fridays, we play trivia. So come on down. We're going to have a good time. I end these videos with the... property that Washington owned, and when I first started doing these live videos about 1.5 years ago, one of the first people, Matt, who's one of the first viewers, noticed the name of the property, and while I was trying to find a sign-off for this video, he recommended I use the name of George Washington's property, and, well, I'm going to sign off with the name of George Washington's property, so I'm going to leave you with Round Bottom. Round Bottom.